Life and Character of General John B. Hood by Mrs. C.M. Winkler, Corsicana, Texas. Written at request and published by authority of Hood's Texas Brigade Association and read before the association by the authoress, June 27, 1885. Drogan and Lambert Printers, John Southgate Binder, Austin, Texas. Chapter 1. Perhaps in the range of possibility, there could have been no more pleasant task assigned me than to prepare a paper for your annual reunion upon the subject of the life and character of the general you all loved so well, in whose military genius you felt the most implicit confidence, and in whose judgment you relied in every hour of your connection together as soldiers of a common cause. I know in the estimation of the brave men forming now only a remnant of a once courageous band, the generals highest in your scale attaining human perfection were Robert E. Lee and John B. Hood. The brilliant achievements of the great Stonewall Jackson inspired you with the loftiest enthusiasm, and each one today is proud to remember he served with that illustrious Confederate in the Army of Northern Virginia. But Robert E. Lee was the man you unquestionably obeyed, while John B. Hood was the man you followed upon every battlefield. He was the man you loved as a dear friend and brother, and around your exploits upon the various fields of strife, where foe met foe in deadly conflict, hang with yours the unfading laurels of his military fame, destined to remain to posterity the deathless inheritance of unselfish patriotism. In the examination of his character, the principles that influence every action of his life, the high sense of honor, the proud record he labored to make for his men and himself, the noble sacrifice of mere personal advancement, the devotion to the cause he followed with persistence, we shall endeavor to faithfully portray his actions in a proper light, while we shall strive to do injustice to no human being. Refined and cultivated, he was elegant and courtly in manner, and a Chesterfield in politeness. As a friend, he was generous and true, possessing the rare faculty of remembering not only the faces, but the names of every man under his command with whom he ever came in contact, which was remarkable considering the number of people with whom he had been thrown at different periods of his life. So true was he to the deep affection he entertained for each member of his old brigade, that he visited as many of them as possible at their homes during a tour he made through Texas after the war was over, refusing the hospitality of many others to enjoy with the men he loved a few hours to re-cement the bond of friendship formed in camp. Upon the weary march, in the hospital, or upon the battlefields, he had helped mark as monuments of daring courage, of matchless bravery, of unparalleled success. When the decree went forth that the warrior's banner must be furled, and the stars and bars with their emblematic Southern Cross must no more be flung to the breeze, and hope no more tinge with radiance the horizon of our sky, around no life of all who had rendered the lost cause such noble service lingered, more of the poetry, romance, and chivalry of the fruitless undertaking than clustered about the name of General John B. Hood. Only at times now do we dare approach the beautiful Confederate temple in Ennis. Only at times do we pass with reverential tread over the crumbling doorstep, matted with weeds and covered with moss, and stand within the edifice overgrown with honeysuckle and ivy. The mosaic pavement wrought by the hands of sister states is stained with the blood of heroes and damp with the tears of widowhood and orphanage. We are privileged to brush the cobwebs and dust from the beautiful images of our great men who have left their impress upon the century, and are forever set up in the sculptured niches there for the admiration of coming ages. Only at times, like the present, do we wreathe their brows once more with the green cedar of undying remembrance, and turning to the daisy-starred graves of our dead brethren, who there too repose, scatter the roses and lilies of our heart's best appreciation above the loved and lost. At such times, then, it becomes our right to recall again the grandeur of the past, and amid the busy turmoil of the world, with its rushing business, its many cares, we, today, turn our steps to our temple in the wildwood, and will devote this hour to the contemplation of one forever gone out of the weariness and strife. He is living still in the memory of all who cherish kindly feeling, noble sentiment, and exalted patriotism, enshrined in that most sacred chamber of all our hearts, as one we knew and loved, destined also to live forever upon the page of history, as long as the archives of the great American nation shall be preserved, and its history shall be read by the admiring millions who will come after us in the cycling ages of the future. General John Bell Hood was born at Owensville, Bath County, Kentucky, June 29, 1831, and was brought up at Mount Sterling, Montgomery County, Kentucky. Of his childhood and youth we know nothing, except that his father was a physician who occupied a high position in the medical world, and was desirous his son should adopt the same profession, offering the inducement of completing his studies in Europe. The young gentleman, however, had his dreams of future glory, and his heart set upon a military life, as his ardor had been excited by the deeds of daring of both his grandfathers, who were soldiers under Washington. They were of English origin, had settled in Virginia, but emigrated to Kentucky, the dark and bloody ground, where they lived in constant warfare with the Indians. And one had married at Fort Boonesborough, the first fortification constructed in the state. His anxiety upon the subject of a military education induced his maternal uncle, Judge French, then a member of Congress, to obtain for him an appointment to West Point. He entered that military academy in 1849 at the age of 17 and graduated in 1853, in the class with Sheridan, McPherson, and Schofield. He was appointed brevet second lieutenant of the 4th Infantry, then serving in California. Sailing from New York via Panama, he reached San Francisco and was stationed a short period at Benica Barracks, where he was directed to report for duty at Fort Jones, Scotts Valley, in the northern part of California, where he found Colonel Buchanan in command of a regiment, with Captain U.S. Grant as quartermaster. While here, game was plentiful, and Lieutenant Hood had another member of his mess sent their surplus game to market, cultivated a field, and sowed wheat. Before this financial scheme came to perfection and the wheat was harvested, he was ordered in command of a detachment of dragoons to serve as escort to Lieutenant Williamson of the Topographical Engineers upon a surveying expedition in the direction of Salt Lake. These duties were soon brought to a close by an appointment as second lieutenant in the 2nd Cavalry, a new regiment organized by Act of Congress in 1855, commanded by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnson, with R.E. Lee as lieutenant colonel and George Thomas and W.J. Hardy as majors. Lieutenant Philip Sheridan relieved him, and he returned to San Francisco en route for Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, the rendezvous of his regiment. Here he met in his bank W.T. Sherman. Thus early was he thrown with the men who were destined to be engaged on different sides of one of the most desperate contests that had ever engaged the attention of the American people. Men who afterwards all became distinguished actors in the great military drama enacted upon the battlefields, rendered illustrious by their skill and valor. Chapter 2. While at Jefferson Barracks, he received his share of the profits of the wheat crop, $1,000 in gold. In November, he marched with his regiment to Fort Belknap, Texas. There were no railroads at this time through this portion of the country, reaching the fort in December. Camp Cooper was established soon afterwards upon the Clear Fork of the Brazos. The government had under advisement the construction of a fort, and Colonel Lee was in the habit of riding over the country in search of a suitable location, taking some of his officers along to get their opinion with regard to establishing a suitable military post. Lieutenant Hood frequently accompanied him on these excursions, and here he spent a most delightful season of enjoyment, galloping over the beautiful prairies, breathing the balmy air, and in association with cultivated gentlemen. There was formed that attachment between Generals Lee and Hood, which was never interrupted throughout their lives. The young lieutenant listening to his elders' words of wisdom, engaging his conduct by the high standard of morality set up for his emulation by the living example of the model gentleman who was his daily companion. Perhaps more than any other, this association had a directing influence upon all his future life, as all who knew General Hood are familiar with his keen sense of humor, his high-bred avoidance of the debasing vices that cast such a blemish upon many human characters. He was ordered to Fort Mason, near the Llano River, during the latter part of this year. On July 5, 1857, he left Fort Mason in command of 25 men on a scouting expedition in search of Indians. Provided with 30 days' rations, with an Indian guide and compass, and actuated by youthful aspirations, the little party traversed the country between the Contra rivers and Mexico, struck a trail, and followed the red men in spite of the desert country or staked plains which lay between the scarcity of water in their canteens and the danger of getting so far away in the wilderness. Orders had been received at camp from Washington before they left that a party of Tonkaway Indians were expected at the reservation, and would raise a white flag as a signal of their approach, and it must be respected. Lieutenant Hood came up with the Indians at a range of hills, and as they raised a white flag, he did not attack. Suddenly, the wily foe threw down the treacherous signal and commenced firing. The struggle now commenced and grew desperate. the Indians coming up and fighting hand to hand. Their ammunition was all expended, the ground covered with a growth of Spanish daggers, strewn with the dead and wounded, while 2 of the scouting party were killed, and several, amongst them Lieutenant Hood, wounded, the latter having his hand pinned to his bridle with an arrow. The attacking party were Comanches and Lipans. The howl of distress from the Indians indicated that they had fought long enough, and when night approached, they gathered up their dead and wounded and moved toward the Rio Grande. The troops returned to Fort Mason. General Twiggs, commanding department, complimented them on their exploit, saying in his official report, "Lieutenant Hood's affair was a gallant one, and much credit is due to both officer and men." It was afterwards learned that the Indians lost 19 warriors. Not long after his return to Fort Mason, he was promoted to the rank of first lieutenant and placed on duty at Camp Colorado, gaining his first distinction by a display of bravery at Devil's River, Texas. In 1858, he established Camp Wood on the Nueces River and continued at this post until, while he was on a leave of absence in November 1860, he was ordered to report for duty as Chief of Cavalry at West Point. He went to Washington and asked to be relieved from the order, stating that he feared war would soon be declared, in which event he preferred to act with freedom. Colonel Cooper, Adjutant General, exclaimed, "Mr. Hood, you surprise me. This is a post and position sought by every soldier." He acceded to the request, and before his leave of absence expired, hostilities were declared. He immediately returned and parted with his command, who were on duty at Indianola, Texas, where he bade his comrades a reluctant farewell. But his duty to his native South seemed paramount to that he owed the United States government, and he felt compelled to obey the dictates of his conscience. Becoming convinced no action would be taken in a decided manner by Kentucky, he proceeded to Montgomery, Alabama, then the seat of the Confederate government, and offered his sword to its service. He was ordered to report to Colonel R.E. Lee at Richmond, who had been placed in command of state troops by authority of the governor of Virginia. We have been particular to notice all these circumstances minutely, to explain General Hood's affection for Texas and his preference upon all occasions for Texas troops. He had visited, during his long service on the Texas frontier, many portions of the beautiful country, and was impressed with its vast and undeveloped resources, and had determined, whenever he tired of the military, to make it his home. When Kentucky, therefore, failed to act, he entered the service from Texas, and ever spoke of it afterwards as his adopted home. Colonel Lee sent him at once to Yorktown to report to Colonel Magruder, who assigned him to the command of some cavalry companies with the rank of major. After the battle of Big Bethel, he led his men out into the swamp and attacked the Federals upon the spot where Colonel Dro of the Louisiana Battalion had been killed. While here annoying with his cavalry the troops in the vicinity of Fortress Monroe, he was promoted lieutenant colonel, and in September was summoned to Richmond, appointed colonel, and directed to organize the 4th Texas Regiment of Infantry, which had arrived from that state and were lying in camp near the city, styled Camp Texas, in honor of the Lone Star State. Had President Davis looked into the future with prophetic vision, he could have made no wiser selection, and doubtless it was after consultation with General Lee, and after mature consideration, the appointment was made. Whatever may have been the motive, Colonel Hood felt no higher compliment could be paid him than to be placed in command of men from the state he loved, and from whence he had thrown his fortunes with the Confederate cause. There had been some dissatisfaction amongst the Texas companies with regard to their organization, and it was feared they would be pleased with no man the officials might select. Very few had ever known Colonel Hood personally, but if any objection was raised, the feeling soon gave way, and everyone became perfectly contented and proud of their commanding officer. Colonel Hood was 6 feet 2 inches in height, broad, full chest, without any surplus flesh, light brown hair and beard, blue eyes, with the softest, tenderest expression, except when excited, then flashing with lightning-like rapidity, commanding in appearance, dignified in manner, courteous to officers and men, and yet strict in his ideas of discipline. He was a man of great personal magnetism, capable of holding the love and commanding the respect of all who came within his influence. His men found him able and ready to give all necessary instruction, not only in drilling them for the field, but also in the forms and technicalities of the clothing, commissary, ordnance, and transportation departments, for the want of which information regiments entering the service frequently had to go hungry, and commissaries and quartermasters made many fruitless trips. All these qualifications made him an eminently proper person to place in command of the Texans, and they soon had the good sense to appreciate their advantage. The Texas regiments went into camp at Dumfries on the lower Occoquan in November, and here Colonel Hood, after the brigade was organized under command of General Winkler, began his course of discipline for the 4th Texas Regiment. This splendid body of men, as he always called them, he desired to become famous in deeds of valor when the time for action came. He taught them by the campfire, on drill, on dress parade, and everywhere the occasion offered, that the number of colors and guns captured and prisoners taken constituted the true test of the work done by any command during an engagement, appealing to their pride. Again, he impressed the lesson of personal responsibility. Each member must feel that in their conduct in camp, when around cities and towns, no comrade must be allowed to bring disgrace upon the regiment, but must be dealt with summarily by the men themselves, thereby instilling a high sense of honor amongst his soldiers. Then he was careful to teach obedience to orders as a cardinal virtue of a soldier, even to putting out the lights at night, as men, if restless themselves, must not disturb others, for to sleep when the chance offered was an important duty and must be strictly attended to in order to march and fight next day. Thus, by every means in his power, he sought to arouse the martial spirit of his men, stimulating them to desire to be first upon the battlefield in bravery, and also first in their deportment, so the world would cast no slur upon their conduct as gentlemen. The other officers warmly entered into the plans and assisted Colonel Hood, the utmost feeling of fraternal regard existing between all during that first winter spent in the sleet, snow, and cold of the Dumfries camp, binding officers and men together with ties that have never been forgotten, and which death itself has not been able to sever. Chapter 3. Colonel Hood was appointed Brigadier General March 7, 1862, while en route to Fredericksburg from their winter quarters, being promoted over the head of the commander of the 5th Texas Regiment, who ranked him by reason of seniority, but who was noble and generous to see the promotion was entirely deserved, and the first to congratulate him upon the added honor. To a man as proud and sensitive as General Hood, this was a pleasing episode of his life. Military men are tenacious with regard to minor points of etiquette, and the least deviation from the code is looked upon with suspicion. They now took the route to Yorktown, taking the cars to Ashland, from thence marching to Yorktown. There the horse arrived, purchased for him by the privates of the 4th Texas Regiment, and presented one evening at dress parade. At Eltham's Landing, on York River, while the evacuation of the peninsula was being effected, Hood's brigade, acting as rear guard of the army, met the Federal troops which had been landed from gunboats to intercept the advance of supplies, and, if possible, cut the Confederate army in twain. General Hood was naturally very anxious with regard to how his men would behave, as this was the first time they were regularly under fire. The charge was gallantly met and repulsed, 4th Texas breaking their advance in gallant style, and running them under the cover of their gunboats, heedless of the danger to themselves, until recalled by the repeated order of General Hood to halt, lest the guns from the boats be turned loose to their utter destruction. This brilliant little affair drew the attention of people and authorities to the Texans, and was the beginning of their success. President Davis said, "They saved the rear of the army and the whole of the baggage train." General Gustav Smith said, "The Texans won immortal honor for themselves, their state, and their commander, General Hood, at Eltham's Landing near West Point." On June 27th, Hood's brigade again distinguished itself and made the reputation which has written their name high upon the roll of honor in the annals of modern warfare. The Battle of Gaines' Mill had been raging previously all day. Numbers of men had marched to the attack of General McClellan's lines and had been mowed down as grass. Grave doubts were being entertained of the day being won. While in this extreme situation, General Lee rode up to General Hood and asked, "Can you break that line of entrenchments?" General Hood replied with characteristic coolness, "I will try." He marched the regiments of his brigade together, supporting one another, directed them not to fire till ordered, told them what General Lee had said, and that he would lead the charge. In a clear, ringing voice, amid the shower of shot and shell, he ordered the 4th Texas Regiment and 18th Georgia to follow. Onward they went to the crest of the hill where so many had faltered. Now came the order to fix bayonets and charge. With a shout, they dashed up the hill, through the abatis, upon the very heads of the Federals, who scattered toward the valley beyond. The other Confederate troops joined in the rout, and the great Confederate victory was won. A participant in the battle said, The secret of our success is found in the discretion exercised by Hood at the top of the hill, where so many have fallen before us, when, instead of halting and making a fight as others had done, he gave the word, and our brave men rushed headlong from the hill, and at short range and with cold steel drove the enemy from their hiding places. At Fraser's Farm, Savage Station, Malvern Hill, Freeman's Ford, and Thoroughfare Gap, General Hood and his men did efficient work for the Confederate cause. During the 2 days of Second Manassas, he was actively engaged, and upon the last day was given command of several brigades, and ordered during the engagement to direct the operations in a difficult position. After his men had run pell-mell over Sickles' Excelsior Brigade of Zouaves and captured the guns of the battery supporting them. It was a fine compliment for General Hood to have been selected at this critical juncture to receive and post the troops set upon the field. Victory again perched upon our banner, and General Hood said of his men, "As to their gallantry and unflinching courage, they stand unsurpassed in the history of the world." At Manassas, General Hood's men captured, amongst other trophies of the war, some ambulances. He thought it best they should retain them for their own use, and refused to turn them over to Major General Evans for a North Carolina regiment. General Evans became very indignant and put him under arrest for disobedience of orders. On the march to Maryland, he was ordered by General Longstreet to remain at Culpeper and wait for a court-martial. General Lee, hearing of the matter, and realizing the injustice of the whole affair, yet not willing to depart from the strict letter of the law, sent instructions he should remain under arrest but continue with his men. The men were very much dissatisfied, and refused to go into the fight at Boonesboro Gap, South Mountain, under the leadership of General Evans, unless General Hood was in command. He reported that the Texas Brigade had mutinied to General Lee, when that officer sent for General Hood and told him he was in a quandary, as he was just going into a fight and one of his best generals under arrest, and requested he should at least say he regretted the affair. General Hood replied, "I am unable to do so, since I cannot admit or see the justice of General Evans's demand for ambulances my men have captured. Had I been ordered to turn them over for the general use of the army, I would cheerfully have acquiesced." "Well," General Lee said, "I will suspend your arrest until the impending battle is decided. Take command of your men." The brigade opened ranks when they saw him approaching, and allowed him to ride through, while cheer after cheer rent the air, notwithstanding they were in the face of the enemy. When the head of the column was reached, he gave the command, "Forward!" and every man gladly obeyed. General D. H. Hill, holding the gap for hours, had been pressed back by superior numbers, when General Hood came to the rescue, and, with fixed bayonets, led his men over the rugged steeps, driving the enemy from their position, and foiling their attempts to relieve the garrison at Harper's Ferry, which was compelled to surrender to Stonewall Jackson. At Sharpsburg he was sent into an exposed position on the battlefield, and remained there, unrelieved and unassisted by the troops General Lee had ordered to his support. Enduring the hottest fire of all the war, his force outnumbered 20 to 1. There they stood with their commander, who dispatched in vain for troops to be sent to his assistance, until they become the wonder and admiration of the enemy fighting in their front. Instead of a court-martial for the retention of captured ambulances, General Hood was recommended for promotion by General Stonewall Jackson after the engagement was over, as shown by the following letter to the commanding general. General, I respectfully recommend that Brigadier General J. B. Hood be promoted to the rank of Major General. He was under my command during the engagement along the Chickahominy, commencing on June 27th last, when he rendered distinguished service. Though not of my command in the recently hard-fought battle near Sharpsburg, Maryland, yet, for a portion of the day, I had occasion to give directions respecting his operations, and it gives me pleasure to say that his duties were discharged with such ability and zeal as to command my admiration. I regard him as one of the most promising officers of the Army. I am, General, your obedient servant, T. J. Jackson, Major General. Shortly afterwards he received the commission of a Major General. The brigades of Generals Law, Benning, Anderson, and Texas Brigade composed the new division, of which General Hood said any general might feel justly honored to command. Chapter 4. Longstreet's corps was sent down into Suffolk, and consequently, when General Hooker crossed the Rappahannock and attacked General Lee at Chancellorsville, he found him at great disadvantage, with one half his men at a distance. Before reaching him, on account of want of transportation, the battle had been fought. On the march, intelligence reached them of the victory and retreat of Hooker across the river to Stafford Heights, and also the news of the awful calamity of the death of Stonewall Jackson. General Hood had been very impatient at the delay, and expressed by letter, as soon as possible, the deep regret he felt at the loss of the brilliant and daring leader to General Lee, who replied: My dear General, upon my return from Richmond I found your letter. I wished for you very much in the last battle, and believe, had I had the whole army with me, General Hooker would have been demolished. But God ordered otherwise. I grieve much over the death of General Jackson. We must endeavor to follow the unselfish devotion and intrepid course he pursued, and we shall be strengthened rather than weakened by his loss. I rely much upon you. You must so inspire and lead your brave division as that it may accomplish the work of a corps. I am and always your friend, R. E. Lee. At Gettysburg, General Hood was ordered to attack up the Emmitsburg road, the enemy being entrenched upon Round Top Mountain. Sending out his scouts, he ascertained what a fearful loss of life would be the price, as it was up a steep declivity, over huge boulders of rock, with the Federal cannon sweeping their ranks. 3 times he remonstrated, and urged to be allowed instead to turn Round Top Mountain by a flank movement, as his division occupied the extreme left, but the request was refused. He led his men under the heavy fire, and in about 20 minutes was severely wounded in the arm and borne from the field. The assault was unsuccessful, as, although the 1st Texas managed to gain temporary possession of the Federal lines and captured 3 guns, yet the others were unable to scale the rocky declivity, driven back by grape and canister, and the slight advantage was lost. the troops in advance being compelled to retire. General Hood always contended if he had been allowed by General Longstreet to use his own judgment, that part of the field would not have been lost. General Hood was now under medical treatment for his wound, which did not, fortunately, necessitate the amputation of his arm. While still in Richmond, under the surgeon's care, Longstreet's corps passed through the city, on their way to join General Bragg in the West, and although but partially recovered, he determined to follow, with his arm still in a sling. Reaching Ringo, Georgia, he was ordered to proceed to Reed's Bridge on the Chickamauga and assume command of the column advancing against the Federals. There he met his men for the first time since Gettysburg, who gave him a touching welcome. During the first day's fighting, he drove the enemy 6 or 7 miles across the Chickamauga. Next day, General Longstreet assigned to him the direction of the left wing of the army, placing 5 divisions under his command. From 9 until 2:30 o'clock, they wrestled with the foe, when, by a charge led by Kershaw's division, the Confederates rushed forward under General Hood's orders, penetrated into the woods beyond the breastworks, and scored another triumph for our arms. Just then, in the supreme moment of success, General Hood fell, pierced by a Minié ball through the thigh. Strange to say, as he afterwards expressed it, while commanding 5 divisions, he fell wounded into the arms of the men composing his old Texas Brigade. He was borne to a field hospital, and one of the most difficult operations performed, amputation of the limb at the thigh. From thence he was removed to a pleasant family residence in Amity Valley, but learning the Federals contemplated a raid to capture him, he was taken to Atlanta and thence to Richmond. Here he remained several months at a private residence, an honored guest, receiving the most flattering testimonials of regard from all classes of people, who did everything in their power to mitigate his sufferings. The Battle of Chickamauga was fought September 19th and 20, but General Hood was only able to mount his horse for exercise in the middle of January. General Longstreet telegraphed the authorities at Richmond on the day General Hood was wounded, urging his promotion to the rank of Lieutenant General. General, I respectfully recommend Major General John B. Hood for promotion to the rank of Lieutenant General for distinguished conduct and ability in the battle of the 20th instant. General Hood handled his troops with a coolness and ability that I have rarely known to any officer on any field, and had the misfortune after winning the battle to lose one of his limbs. Respectfully, J. Longstreet, Lieutenant General. General Bragg failed to follow up the victory and advance upon Chattanooga, only 10 miles distant, allowing the Federals to fortify. He fought at Lookout Mountain and at Missionary Ridge, but previous to that engagement, General Longstreet was sent to Knoxville to attack General Burnside. General Bragg thus scattering his forces while the enemy were concentrating theirs. After a severe engagement at Missionary Ridge, General Bragg was in full retreat, having left all his strong positions on Lookout Mountain, Chattanooga Valley, and Missionary Ridge in the hands of the foe, going to Ringgold and thence to Dalton, Georgia. So much dissatisfaction was expressed with regard to General Bragg's movements. He was relieved from duty, and General Joseph E. Johnston assumed command December 16, 1863. Simultaneously with General Grant's advance upon Richmond to crush out the Army of Northern Virginia, General Sherman conceived the plan of moving upon the Army of the West, sending 3 columns toward Dalton, front, northeast, and southeast, and by a flank movement at Resaca, compelling Johnston to evacuate Dalton. General Johnston engaged in a kind of desultory fighting at Resaca Valley, at New Hope Church, and at Kennesaw Mountain. General Sherman again executed a flank movement, and General Johnston was compelled to abandon the mountain defense and retire towards Atlanta. This retreat was consummated without any considerable military disaster, but was a disappointment both to the authorities at Richmond and the people generally. The Federals were now in possession of half of Georgia. The Confederates had abandoned one of the finest wheat districts of the Confederacy, almost ripe for the harvest, and at Rome and Etowah River had surrendered the iron rolling mills and government works of great value. This culminated in the removal, before Atlanta, of General Johnston. But we must not anticipate, but go back and give a few reasons for General Johnston's antipathy to General Hood, whom he subjected to such severe criticism in his book. Chapter 5. At Carrsville, General Johnston did not consult the corps commanders, as is usual, and give them explicit directions, as he issued only a general order that he intended to fight. Generals Hood and Polk were subjected to an enfilading fire for 2 or 3 hours, and, after consultation, decided to apprise the commanding general that the line held was untenable for defense, and if he did not intend to assume the offensive morning, they would advise him to change his position. General Johnston reported he had intended to fight there, but Generals Hood and Polk urged him to abandon the ground immediately. General Hood said in his work, Advance and Retreat, "I do this day and hour, in the name of truth, honor, and justice, in the name of the departed soul of the Christian and noble Polk, and in the presence of the Creator, most solemnly deny that General Polk or I recommended General Johnston at Carrsville to retreat when he intended to give battle, and affirm that the recommendation made by us to change his position was throughout the discussion coupled with the proviso, if he did not intend to force a pitched battle with General Sherman." General Johnston was relieved of his command July 17th. The telegram from the War Department reading thus: Lieutenant General Hood has been commissioned to the temporary rank of general under the late law of Congress. I am directed by the Secretary of War to inform you that, as you have failed to arrest the advance of the enemy to the vicinity of Atlanta, far into the interior of Georgia, and express no confidence that you can defeat or repel him, you are hereby relieved from the command of the Army and Department of Tennessee, which you will immediately turn over to General Hood. Upon the receipt of this startling and unexpected order, General Hood sought an interview with General Johnston and requested him to pocket the order and leave him to command his corps and fight the Battle of Atlanta, as General Sherman was rapidly approaching with the avowed intention of capturing the city. He replied that the President had seen fit to relieve him, and it would have so to be, unless the order was countermanded. Lieutenant Generals Hardee and Stewart then joined General Hood in a telegram to the President requesting the order of his removal be postponed at least until the fate of Atlanta was decided. We give an extract from the President's reply. A change of commanders under existing circumstances was regarded as so objectionable that I only accepted it as the alternative of continuing a policy which has proven disastrous. The order has been executed, and I cannot suspend it without making the case worse than it was before the order was issued. General Hood returned to General Johnston and urged him to remain in command and fight for Atlanta. He refused. Then General Hood referred to the embarrassment of his position, not being familiar with even the 2 remaining corps of the army, and besought him to at least remain and give him the benefit of his counsel while he determined the issue. He finally promised, after riding into Atlanta, to return, yet, without a word of explanation, left for Macon, Georgia, the same evening. The personnel of the 2 armies of Virginia and the West were alike, but while one army had been fighting without breastworks, the other had been protected by entrenchments, the constant use of which causes soldiers to look for protection, while those who fight in an open field manifest a spirit of indifference and self-reliance perfectly irresistible to every barrier. It was a part of General Lee's creed that the constant use of breastworks would finally impair the morale of the best disciplined army. General Hood says, "Moreover, the highest perfection in the education of troops well disciplined can only be attained through continued appeals to their pride and through incitement to make known their prowess by the substantial test of guns and colors captured upon the field of battle. Soldiers thus educated will ever prove a terror to the foe." We have seen that this was his first instruction to the soldiers of the 4th Texas Regiment when he first took command of them at Richmond, and he always affirmed this was what had made the whole brigade afterwards so invincible in the presence of the enemy. General Lee made use of entrenchments only as a dernier resort, or in order to hold a portion of his line while he attacked the main body, and when he did entrench, marched to where the line was to be defended, and did not risk a succession of petty skirmishes. General Johnston not only made uniform use of entrenchments, but retreated and fought at the same time, an error which General Lee always eschewed, and one which should always be avoided, since the long continuance of such a policy will prove the inevitable ruin of any army. Lord Napier, the highest authority on war, says, "It is unquestionable that a retreating army should fight as little as possible." We are not proposing to descant upon General Johnston's errors, but merely wish to do entire justice to our hero, who took command of this army under such disadvantaged circumstances, which, coupled with the dissatisfaction of the men who had become disheartened by the continued retreating and had deserted by hundreds, helping on the demoralization, made it such an exceedingly difficult position to fill with either credit to himself or honor for the cause. The statement of Generals Hardee and Stewart that the army, after crossing the Chattahoochee, had as much spirit and confidence as it possessed at Dalton, General Hood declares to be erroneous. They had been accustomed to the plans of the Western campaign and knew nothing of the high state of perfection obtained in the Virginia Army under the training and mode of handling by General Lee. General Johnston had retreated 300 miles when he reached Atlanta, which he afterwards stated he could have held forever. But, judging by analogy, it is to be presumed his military skill would have devised no better plan than General Hood's. Chapter 6. General Hood attacked the enemy's right at Peachtree Creek, July 20th, gaining some advantage. Pollard says this was one of the most reckless and headlong charges of the war. On the 22nd, he again engaged them, and on July 28th, he made another attack. General Sherman said Hood's advance was magnificent, but the superior numbers, the skillful formation of their lines, secured them the day, and both generals fortified and set themselves down for a siege like Grant and Lee. Afterwards, at Richmond, indicating that the plans of the two Federals were identical in their intentions. For several weeks, General Sherman bombarded the city, accomplishing little. General Hood sent off his cavalry to raid on Sherman's line of communication. Instantly, the Federals went after them with the principal portion of their army, literally dividing the Confederate forces. Sherman says, "At last, Hood made the mistake we had waited for so long. As he became conscious he was outflanked, there was nothing to do but blow up his magazines, destroy his supplies, and evacuate." Sherman had won, after the spirit of the army had revived by the bold maneuvers of General Hood. The loss of Atlanta was a serious blow to the Confederacy. President Davis determined upon a visit to General Hood's headquarters, but he never lost faith in the man he had placed at the head of affairs, believing, if any man could conduct the Western army to victory, that man was General Hood. He addressed the troops in hopeful and encouraging terms. General Hood crossed the Chattahoochee River September 29th and concentrated at Powder Springs, Georgia. General Sherman moved in pursuit, declaring he would destroy Hood, who moved westward and attacked Dalton, which surrendered. Hood now moved west, and, after holding the gaps of Pigeon Mountain as long as possible, suddenly moved south to Gladstone, Alabama, thence through Lookout Mountain to Decatur on the Tennessee River, where he formed a junction with a portion of General Dick Taylor's army. Sherman dared not follow him from his base of supplies, and now saw into Hood's plan to strike a blow to recover Middle Tennessee. So, dividing his army, leaving Thomas in charge of Tennessee, he returned to Atlanta and struck off through Georgia and South Carolina on his march to the sea, one of the most unexampled campaigns upon record, devastating and laying the whole country in waste in his track. Now General Hood began his movement from Alabama to Tennessee, and after marching and countermarching and skirmishing, he found himself at Franklin, confronting 3 lines of breastworks and 3 lines of battle. He determined to attack at once, with his men enthusiastic in the extreme, and threw forward his advancing columns with all the dexterity for which he had ever been noted. The first line was swept clean, the men fighting hand to hand for a while with those in the ditches and those behind entrenchments, but the foe was compelled to yield, flying across the field. Next morning it was discovered the Federals had fled toward Nashville. Hood advanced upon Nashville and for 2 weeks laid siege to the city. General Thomas decided to attack General Hood and on October 15th made a general advance upon his line. The battle waged furiously until about 3 o'clock. General Hood, still believing he held another splendid victory in his grasp, while Bates' division in the center of his line suddenly gave way from the moving of troops, making that point more easily accessible by the enemy. Thomas's men, by the sheer force of numbers, beat down, killed and wounded, and captured nearly all the men holding the breastworks. The moment a break was made in the line, the 2 corps of the army fled without firing a gun. The loss in killed and wounded disgracefully small, but the whole army demoralized and scattered beyond recall. One of the most remarkable defeats, when success was seemingly imminent, that the pages of modern warfare chronicled. General Hood crossed the Tennessee River with a remnant of his army and telegraphed the authorities at Richmond asking to be relieved of his command. The request being granted, he took leave of his army January 23, 1865, as follows: Soldiers, at my request, I have this day been relieved from command of the army. In taking leave of you, accept my thanks for the patronage with which you have endured your hardships during the recent campaign. I am alone responsible for its conception and strove hard to do my duty in its execution. I urge upon you the importance of giving your entire support to the distinguished soldier who now assumes command, and shall look with deep interest on all your future operations and rejoice at your successes. J.B. Hood. The affair was deeply humiliating to General Hood, who had, up to the moment when defeat set its seal upon the hope of success, believed he would yet conquer, and had projected a plan of operations for the following day. After the sad finale of turning over the troops to his successor, he proceeded to Richmond, and was cheered by the confidence reposed in him by the authorities in sending him to the Trans-Mississippi Department to bring to the assistance of General Lee all the troops who would follow him. While en route under these orders, he received the painful news of the surrender of General Lee, and, not willing yet to give up, continued his journey until he learned of General Kirby Smith's disbandment in the Trans-Mississippi Department. May 31st, 1865, he rode into Natchez and surrendered his sword to Major General Davidson, who bade him courteously retain it and allowed him to proceed on his way to New Orleans. Thus, we perceive, General Hood was one of the first to enter the Confederate cause and the last general to give up his sword. Chapter 7. Othello's occupation was now gone. Being all his life a military man, when the Confederacy became only a dream of the past, it was difficult to get accustomed to the situation, and to bring his mind into the narrow limits of the ordinary business affairs of life, after handling armies, required almost Spartan courage to endure. Forming a company with other distinguished Southern gentlemen, he entered into the insurance business, but the profits were not remunerative, and they dissolved, he being only an agent afterwards for other companies until the time of his death. He married in New Orleans after the war Miss Hannon, daughter of a once distinguished jurist, who possessed all those refined, womanly traits of character calculated to make the sum total of man's earthly happiness while a group of loving children gathered around their hearthstone, of whom any parents might be proud. Thus the years passed on, surrounded by the tenderest joys of earth, until in an evil hour disease laid its heavy hand upon the wife and mother, and she died suddenly of yellow fever. Just 3 weeks afterwards the brave general, the noble friend, the tender father, followed that faithful wife to that land where the weary are at rest, and loved ones are again united. Tortured with the realization of the destitute and helpless condition of his young children, one of whom died the same day as the father, remembering all the devotion of his old soldiers, he bequeathed to them a touching legacy, saying, "I leave my children to Hood's Texas Brigade." The whole country was shocked at the misfortune that had overtaken these doubly orphaned ones, and the brigade accepted the trust in good faith. Mrs. Hannon, their grandmother, came to Austin, Texas, and selected for them a home, the brigade having made arrangements to care for them and educate them properly. But it was decreed otherwise. Just before the preparations for removal were complete, the grandmother died, and the guardians appointed by her decided to accept the invitation of wealthy citizens North and South, who formally adopted the little ones as their own, promising to make them heirs of their fortunes. The brigade submitted to this arrangement, not through any desire to shirk the responsibility, but because, with their broken fortunes and disseminated numbers, the future interests of the children were better secured. In looking over the record of this man amongst men, we are struck with the nobility of purpose, the faith in his own powers, the belief in the justice of the cause, the wonderful amount of perseverance he displayed, and the powerful will subservient to his control. Wounded in the arm, which was never entirely sound afterwards, with the loss of a limb, amputated by one of the most difficult operations, destined ever afterwards to walk only on crutches, he conceived and carried out the Western campaign, which only lacked success to place it among the rest of his remarkable exploits, ever evincing that indomitable spirit which reigned in the bosom of General Lee. General Frank Blair said of him, "The great fault of both Johnston and Hood was that they did not have men enough to contend with Sherman's army. It was natural enough, after the failure of General Johnston, to check our advance. Either tactics should be employed, and no man could have been found who could have executed this policy with greater skill, ability, and vigor than General Hood." His remains lie today in Washington Street Cemetery, New Orleans, in the tomb with his wife and young daughter, with only a plain marble slab to mark the spot and tell to passers-by that a great man's ashes there molder into decay, the tablet bearing only this inscription: "John Bell Hood, General in the late Confederate Army, born June 29, 1831, at Owensville, Kentucky, died August 30, 1879. When we visited New Orleans last year, we made a pilgrimage to the spot where the silence of the cemetery is undisturbed by any sound save the breeze stirring the leaves in the trees. From the branches the long moss hangs with graceful drapery, and where only a bright-colored rose stands sentinel above the head of the fallen brave. We stood and gazed at the bronze statue of General Lee, erected as a monument to his matchless genius, at the intersection of two streets in the busy marts of New Orleans. visited the Médière Cemetery, and stood within the tomb of the Louisiana soldiers from the Army of Northern Virginia, bearing upon its summit in granite the life-size statue of General Jackson, and the thought would intrude, what has Texas done to commemorate the deeds of daring of her own adopted son, General Hood, who was so proud to claim his connection with her people? The great hope sprang up that sometime in the future we would have his statue in marble within our state capitol grounds, telling with mute eloquence the story of our affection and placing his record before the world with grateful remembrance. No more the Confederate temple re-echoes with the shout of jubilant thousands. Our voices today beneath its dome sound awful and sepulchral, and, closing the door with bowed head, we steal away in the gathering shadows. Deep down in our hearts is the belief that when the roll of centuries is called, if the scattered remnant of the old brigade, christened with the name of their leader, will only remain faithful to the principles that actuated his life, as one by one they cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees, they will receive the welcome plaudit from the Commander of the universe. Well done, good and faithful servant. You will then, with clearer vision, read from the book of fate and understand that our lost cause, with its fearful baptism of blood and tears and terrible sacrifice of life and fortune, has not been in vain. If it has led you up the rugged heights to the shining portals of the sweet by and by, be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. End of Life and Character of General John B. Hood. About the author. Angelina Virginia Smith was born June 2, 1842, in Richmond, Virginia. When the Civil War broke out, she devoted herself to the care of the sick, the wounded, and the dying soldiers in the hospitals. During those days, she lost her father, mother, a brother, and other near relatives. The war swept away her estate, and the parental home was left a ruin. In June 1864, she married Lieutenant Colonel Clinton McCamey Winkler of the 4th Texas Regiment. Mr. Winkler had been a prominent lawyer of Corsicana, Texas. After the surrender of Appomattox, Mrs. Winkler and her husband returned to Corsicana, where they established a new home and raised 6 children. Winkler had contributed some popular articles to the Southern Illustrated News and Magnolia, published in Richmond, Virginia, and newspapers and magazines in Texas and other Southern states. During the period of 1882 to 85, she undertook the publication of a literary magazine, Texas Prairie Flower. She was a member of the Texas Press Association and was appointed honorary commissioner for Texas to the World Cotton Centennial in New Orleans. She organized associations for work in the Women's Department of Texas. Her chief work was the preparation of historical work entitled The Confederate Capital and Hood's Texas Brigade. From 1889 to 93, she served as associate editor and business manager of the Round Table, a monthly magazine of literary miscellany published in Texas. After her husband died, Virginia moved to El Paso in 1903, and later accomplished the organization of the Robert E. Lee chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She died May 4, 1911, and is buried in El Paso. Biography credit to Navarro County Genealogical Society. Thank you for stopping by, Lady Carrie Ann. Please subscribe, like, and share. Count your many blessings every single day.